Hello again. This video is going to try and explain the concept of the level of analysis in comparative politics. So when you're trying to explain political phenomena, that is to say you're trying to explain your dependent variable. So in the example we've been using, democratization, you have to start somewhere. So you have to have some idea of what kind of independent variable is going to do all the work in your explanation. The level of analysis is a way to describe the type of independent variable that you're using in your study. And usually using one level of analysis over another commits the scholar to a set of assumptions about what sorts of things in politics actually matter, about what's really driving the story. Now, no one's committed to saying the same level of analysis is equally useful for every type of political phenomenon, but generally scholars group themselves under the sorts of levels of analysis that they prefer to study, that they find most meaningful. So there are three basic levels of analysis: the individual, culture, and structures. Now, under the tags the individual, these explanations are starting with, individuals, right? So rational choice theory starts by assuming things about individuals, that they are namely rational, that their preferences are structured a certain way, and that they prefer more to less, so they're maximizers. And more psychological explanations will tend to look at individuals and look at their particular psychologies, particularly the psychologies of key decision makers, and explain what happened based on the psychological tendencies of that particular decision maker. Cultural explanations can be divided into subjective and intersubjective varieties. Long words, but they're not too difficult to understand. Subjective approaches to culture examine how individuals internalize individual values and attitudes, and that becomes the object of the study. So basically, culturalists who study culture subjectively end up doing a lot of surveys of individuals and questioning individuals about how they understand or perceive events, whereas intersubjective culturalists focus on the shared meanings and identities that constitutes the symbolic, expressive, and interpretive part of social life. What that means, roughly speaking, is that they're going to be looking at symbols and larger scale cultural processes or practices, but not going to be asking the individual exactly how they feel about them. So there's two different ways of approaching culture. And finally, structure. Structure and structuralists tend to be the most diverse group. In there, we throw people who focus on institutions, people who look at a variety of social cleavages, and social cleavages just mean ways of cutting up citizens into different groups based on their belonging to a particular ascriptive group. So rural versus urban interests would be a kind of social cleavage. Middle class versus upper class and lower class is another kind of social cleavage, right? You define people based on their income, you define them based on where they live, you could define them based on their gender, their race, their religion. In different countries, different kinds of cleavages end up becoming more important, but the point is that you are grouping people up and predicting events based on, at least in part, the distribution of social cleavages and who is in what group. And finally, all manners of explanations that start with economics are also structuralist, right? So if we're looking at large-scale economic variables, like, for instance, income per capita in a country, and using that as a driving variable, then we're probably structuralists. Okay, so deepening our insights a little bit into each of these, I want to talk a little about rational choice theory. The rational choice method of analysis is principally inherited from the field of economics. Rational choice theory tends to assume that individuals respond rationally to incentives. That is to say, regardless of culture or structures in society, rational choice theory assumes that individuals are basically rational maximizers of their individual preferences. Now here, rationality has a fairly technical definition, and we don't have to get into it in any depth, but roughly it means that individuals prefer to have more than less, and that their preferences don't contradict one another. Their preferences are transitive, it's said. So that means if the preferences are transitive, what that means is that if a person prefers A to B and B to C, then they also have to prefer A to C. That makes the preferences transitive. If they prefer C to A in this example, then their preferences are intransitive, and therefore, according to rational choice theory, these people would be irrational. Right? So if you prefer, say, vanilla ice cream to chocolate ice cream, and you prefer chocolate ice cream to banana ice cream, if you prefer banana to vanilla, on the rational choice theory, you would be irrational. That would make no sense. Okay, so given these assumptions about individuals, they prefer more to less. And note that a lot of people have criticized rational choice theory because people are assumed to be usually selfish maximizers of money. Now, there's nothing about rational choice theory that assumes that your preferences have to be selfish. You can model the behavior of altruists in a rational choice sort of manner, where people are maximizing their preferences for altruism, for example. So it doesn't require people to be selfish. It just requires people to have values, that those values make sense, and that people are capable of discerning rationally how to pursue those values in a way that makes sense. So on this sort of view, if we study individual preferences and constraints, we can usually predict political phenomena. And constraints here are often institutional, like rules, laws, customs, right? So the rational individual maximizer will choose to obey the law if he or she thinks that the cost of disobeying is generally larger than the cost of obeying, right? That's the sort of rational choice way of approaching whether to obey the law or not. What happens to me if I get caught? What happens to me if I don't? What are the benefits of breaking the law? What are the costs of breaking the law? And the rational choice agent is going to make a decision based on cost and benefit, based on their pre-existing preferences. Or sometimes the constraints aren't institutional, but they have to do with scarcity, available resources. So people maximize their well-being based on how much money they have, and so their money provides a constraint on what they choose to do. So if you have a very relatively modest income, you could spend all of your money on a car payment for a Ferrari, but that would leave you no money for food and rent, and so most people would, rationally speaking, if they were poor, not buy a Ferrari. Now, rational choice models can be models of strategic interaction. Strategic interaction simply means that individuals base their rational choices on the predicted rational choices of others. That is to say, not only are we rational agents, but we understand that others are strategically behaving rational agents. And so this means that we have to react to them in a way that, or we model their behavior and their likely behavior based on a rational calculus. And so, this very much is modeled by games like chess or poker, figuring out what people are bluffing, or in chess, figuring out what the best move is. We figure out what those moves are based on what we think the other person is going to do, given the way the board is set up. And this may sound like it's far away from politics, but really it's not at all. Think of like a classic arms race between two countries. Think about negative political advertising. Think about hiring discrimination in favor of attractive job applicants. I would argue that in all these cases, people are basing their behavior, how to dress for a job interview, whether or not to engage in negative advertising, and whether or not to spend money on guns rather than butter. All these decisions that states or individuals make can be explained by their reaction to the likely strategic decisions of other job candidates, of the other candidate in the campaign, or the other state that is your neighbor, and that might also want to have a choice between guns and butter. Now, so these classic models often start with the prisoner's dilemma. And the prisoner's dilemma, let's see if I can pull it up here. The prisoner's dilemma is, you may have seen this before, and if you have, great. If you haven't, it's not the end of the world. I don't think there's going to be a test on the prisoner's dilemma, but it just gives you a flavor of what rational choice theory is like. Now, in a prisoner's dilemma, two individuals have to choose between two courses of action without knowledge of what the other will do and without being able to communicate with the other. And each makes their decision simultaneously, so they make the decision at the same time. Now, visually, the interaction can be modeled in the grid that you can see on the screen. The interaction is modeled as a classic case of a husband and wife who are accused of crime and interrogated separately. You may have seen this on Law and Order a couple dozen times. And generally speaking, the interrogators offer some options to the husband and the wife simultaneously about what will happen if they confess and what will happen if they deny. And the key to the setup here is that no matter what the other spouse does, there's one choice that is best for each spouse. Now, each spouse faces exactly the same choice, right? So they're not facing different choices. And it turns out that there is what we call a dominant strategy. That is, there's a strategy that is best for you no matter what the other does. And if you've looked at this a little bit, you can probably tell what the dominant strategy is. The dominant strategy here is to confess. And the reason is the dominant strategy is to confess is because you look at the payoff of what happens if, let's say, the husband confesses, and if the husband confesses, what can happen to him? Well, if the husband confesses and the wife confesses, he gets 10 years. If the husband confesses and the wife denies, right, the husband will get, in this case, 1 year. Now, if the husband denies the accusation and the wife confesses, then he's the one who gets 25 years, and his wife gets 1 year. And if both deny, then he gets 3 years and his wife gets 3 years. But what really matters is the idea is that if you confess and the other person, if you deny and what the other person confesses, you get 25 years. Whereas if you confess and the other person confesses, you get 10 years. Clearly, it's better to confess. Confess is better than to deny for you. You'd much rather have 10 years. What happens if you deny? If you deny and the other person denies, then yes, then you get 3 years. Whereas if you confess and the other person denies, you get 1 year. So again, it's better to confess than to deny, no matter what the other person does. And that's the key. No matter what the wife chooses, it is better for you to confess as an individual. That's clear. But as a couple, note that the best strategy for the couple as a group would be to deny. And that's easy to see because the total sentences, right, 3 plus 3, if both deny, would be 6 years. And instead of either 20 years if they both confess or 26 years if one of them confesses and denies and the other denies. Point being, the group would be better off as a whole if they could somehow agree to deny. But as individuals, their maximizing strategy is to confess. Now, what does the prisoner's dilemma explain? Well, in terms of political phenomena, again, the classic arms race between two countries. If I spend money on guns rather than butter, what happens? Well, at worst, the other country also spends money on guns, but at least I'm safe. And if they spend money on butter, then great, I can even invade them. If I spend money on butter and the other spends money on butter, great, but if I spend money on butter and they spend money on guns, they might invade me. The point is that I'm better off always spending money on guns, no matter what the other person does, even though the two countries as a whole would probably waste fewer resources if they were to agree somehow to spend money on butter. This idea of the security dilemma and the arms race is sort of endemic to international relations, but the prisoner's dilemma can be applied just about anywhere. Okay, so there are other models that aren't the prisoner's dilemma. Some of them you may have heard of. There's the free rider problem, the thermostat model, the tragedy of the commons, the ultimatum game. All of these are basically rational choice games that are set up to explain real-world situations based on, again, the assumptions of rational choice theory. Now, there are some advantages to rational choice theory. Rational choice theory yields pretty precise predictions about what people are going to do, and that's helpful if you're trying to predict behavior. And it's a good starting point for investigations, because once you have your prediction, you can go out into the world and collect some data and find out if people really actually behave this way, if the situation turns out the way the model predicts. On the other hand, it's worth noting that in political situations, people aren't always that rational. Moreover, people's preferences aren't always independent from one another, and that's actually one of the other assumptions that I haven't talked about, but is that people have to have preferences that are independent from one another in order for this to work. But of course, you might think that a lot of the time the husband and the wife will in fact agree on the cooperative outcome, that is to say, deny the charges, and arrive at the group best outcome, which is deny. And they'll do so because they don't just care about whether they go to jail, but they also care about whether their spouse goes to jail, because they love one another. And so once, emotions like love or pride or patriotism come into play, it's possible that rational choice theory no longer predicts the outcome, because rational choice theory, of course, predicts that they'll both confess and they'll both go to jail longer than they want to. Okay, so that's a disadvantage. The disadvantage is that it only works when people are behaving roughly according to the assumptions that are stated or assumed by the model. Okay, moving forward a little bit. What about culture? Well, culture, so first of all, political science inherits cultural explanations from anthropology and sociology. And culture is famously hard to define. Culture is a system of meanings that people use to manage their daily world. It's also the basis of social and political identity, and it affects how people line up and how they act in the world. So it's a framework for organizing the world, for locating the self relative to others, for predicting the behavior of others, for linking collective identities to political activity, and motivating people towards some actions and away from other actions. Cliff Gertz defines it as an historically transmitted pattern of meaning embodied in symbols, a system of inherited conceptions expressed in symbolic form by means of which men communicate, perpetuate, and develop their knowledge about attitudes towards life. Okay, that's a mouthful, but basically, again, what Gertz is saying here is that culture is ultimately a system of symbols that relate to one another. So symbols here can be ideas like the American dream, or rugged individualism and self-reliance, or I don't know, what have you, the flag. These are all symbols, and they all relate to one another, and people all understand what they mean and all behave in a certain way because of their existence. And if people didn't aspire to, I don't know, middle-class comfort, then policies in the United States would probably be different, and a whole host of things would probably be different. So now, more than just trying to explain phenomena, the cultural approach also tries to ascertain the meaning of events through the lens of shared symbols operating in that culture. You try to figure out what events and political changes actually mean, not just trying to come up with an explanation of why people are doing what they're doing. Now, sharing a culture doesn't mean that everyone agrees on everything. Not everybody agrees about what the American dream is, and not everybody believes in the American dream. But people within the culture all understand what the American dream is and orient themselves in the world based on whether they support or oppose the ideal. So not everybody has to agree for a cultural symbol to be meaningful and to help orient people either with one another or against one another. Okay, so this means that within a given nation, there can probably be many cultures and subcultures. And so culture will highlight areas of conflict as well as areas of agreement. For example, liberal political culture may agree on certain rights, but also places a lot of importance on the conflict between values like, say, freedom and equality. So, as Leighton says, culture helps order political priorities. It defines the symbolic and material objects that people consider valuable and worth fighting over. And in that sense, culture claims to define some of the preferences and constraints that rational choice theorists tend to take as given. Remember, rational choice theorists tend to think that your preferences are rational and structured, and they're transitive, and that they are independent from one another. And when that's not true, culture can help fill in the gaps, so to speak. Now, cultural explanations are often sort of common sense and intuitive. Why is Russia behaving the way it's behaving? Well, the Russian people have a certain political culture, and they're willing to go along with certain kinds of policies and not with other kinds of policies because some policies suit them better, for example. So cultural explanations are often quite intuitive. On the other hand, defining culture is really hard. So it's kind of difficult to know when an analysis is just plain wrong. Because if something doesn't make sense, then it could just be that you've defined culture the wrong sort of way. Culture is not really amenable to being broken down into variables. It's not really amenable to being quantified, and so it's difficult to know when an explanation is right or wrong. In other words, you may just be making up a story about the culture just to conveniently explain what people are doing, but it might not have any basis in reality. Or worse, it could be that the political structures, and we're going to get to structure in a minute, but the political structures are actually influencing the culture, and so the story doesn't start with culture, it starts with structure. Another problem is that culture is often understood as changing slowly. Culture is supposed to be a fairly stable set of symbols and shared assumptions about the world, and many political events actually happen quite rapidly. And for that reason, culture may not be a good way to analyze a lot of important political changes, particularly sudden changes, because if, I don't know, there's a regime change, a country goes from being an autocracy to a democracy, well, it's unlikely that culture just changed overnight. Certainly it doesn't help you explain why it happened then and there, right? You might say the culture has been changing for a while in a more democratic direction, and so therefore transition to democracy was likely, but doesn't really explain why at that particular moment the autocracy fell. So because of this problem of pacing, culture may be able to explain some long-term trends, or changes in culture may explain changes in long-term trends, but things that are happening rapidly are hard to explain with cultural explanations. Okay, let's finally turn to our last level of analysis, and that is structure. Now, structural theories are inherited from the fields of history and sociology, and especially the Marxist tradition. Structural theories use large-scale phenomena and processes as a starting point for explaining events, trends, or equilibria. And equilibrium is simply a stable ordering of things, right? So you can explain stability as well as change. So you can explain variation, or you can explain things not varying. Structural explanations of politics often pay attention to the manner in which the contours of institutions shape the formation and aggregation of individual and group interests. What does that mean? Well, in a nutshell, it means that structural explanations focus on large-scale variables and how those ultimately affect the formation of individual preferences and interests. So once again, it's not so much the culture that's doing the work, but it is the social structures, right? And these social structures are often certain kinds of cleavages, right? So people behave the way they behave because ultimately they belong to a certain race, a certain income group, a certain region. They live in a certain region, they have a certain profession, perhaps. So at the end of the day, people behave how they behave, not because of individual rational choices, but because of the influence of these large-scale processes. Okay, so structuralists will try to explain cultural preferences as well as individual behavior as responses to rules, states, political coalitions, social classes, underlying economic and social phenomena like globalization or income trends, or economic organizations like unions and business organizations. Now, structuralists are much more diverse groups. Like, different structuralists have different structures that they care about. Marxists care very much about social class, but other types of structuralists don't think that social class is as important as other types of variables. But the point is that they react both against the individualists because they think that ultimately individual preferences can be pretty well predicted by large-scale influences, and against culture in part because they think that culture is influenced by structures. Which brings us back to our fundamental debate here as to where to start with the level of analysis. Like, where does the story start? Does the story start with individuals? Does the story start with culture? Does the story start with large-scale social structures? So what ties structuralists together is a belief that ultimately ideology and culture are secondary or determined by economic concerns or power concerns, and a skepticism that analysis of individual strategic behavior is going to be enough to make sense of some of the big long-term stable equilibria that we see in society. And finally, that rational choice theory doesn't pay attention enough to history, right? Because it considers individuals almost abstracted from their historical and cultural environments. So these are the big debates about how to explain political phenomena and ultimately where to start.